Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, I have a little bit of a different episode for you. For those of you who follow me on social media or know me or have known me for any length of time, you may or may not know that I am rather obsessed with the Olympics. I have loved everything to do with the Olympics since I was a little kid. Like, I very vividly remember watching the Olympics, like back when I was a child, and not even knowing a lot about a lot of the sports, but just knowing sort of that the event was a really big event and like getting kind of wrapped up in like the whole, sort of event of the Olympics. And so I've always been fascinated by the Olympics. I generally like sports, just any type of sport and any event, and you can often watch me. Like, if I have the TV on, it's usually some sort of sporting event kind of going on in the background. But I particularly love the Olympics because I love watching a lot of the events that we don't see showcased on kind of mainstream sports coverage. So I'm less likely to watch professional sports leagues like baseball and hockey and things like that. I do sometimes, but I love some of the more fringe sports. And so, throughout the year, I do follow some of these sports, and you can kind of find televised coverage of like track and field, like the Diamond Series or the World Championships or things like that. But the Olympics is a time where you really get to like access all of this so easily. So needless to say, I was glued to most of the Paris Olympics. We went away for the last part of the games. We were at a family camp down in the US that we go to every summer. And so when I was there, I didn't have a lot of access to actually watching much of the Olympics. So I didn't see all of the events I would normally see. But for the first part of the Olympics, I was absolutely glued to it. And I just like love the Olympics. So as I was watching, there was a few things that kind of stood out with these games in particular, but maybe like sports in general or the Olympics in general. And so I thought I would do a fun little podcast episode just highlighting 6 things that I think the dance world can learn from elite sport, or specifically from the Olympics. So I'm just going to go through some of those. If you are somebody who doesn't follow a lot of sports or maybe didn't follow the Olympics, I still think you'll get a lot out of this episode, because these are just things that we could consider or should consider potentially implementing within the dance world. And some of it are things that you've heard me talk about before. But like I said, just 6 things that I think were really showcased super well or highlighted really well at the Olympics that the dance world could, consider embracing or consider implementing. So these are in absolutely no particular order. This is not like a priority order or anything like that. It's just 6 things that I kind of noticed and was like, yeah, this really should hold true for the dance world as well. So number 1, athletes prioritizing their mental health. The most obvious, and I'll come back to gymnastics tons throughout this podcast episode because it's one of my favorite events to watch. And obviously there's a lot of crossover just in terms of it being like an artistic sport as well and having that artistic element to it. But the most obvious example of that is the Simone Biles story. And I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with that. So she withdrew from the last Olympics, from the Tokyo Olympics, because of some struggle she was having with her mental health, and really has spent the time between those Olympics and now prioritizing that. And she's been really outspoken about kind of her struggles with mental health and how she's prioritized that and how she's worked on it. And she took a step away from the sport. She did not compete for, I think it was about 2 years. Don't quote me on that, but a period of time. She actually stepped away from the sport to prioritize her mental health and came back obviously stronger than ever. So we all know that she is the GOAT of gymnastics and had an incredibly successful games. But the one thing that was so striking to me about her participation and competing at these Olympics was how much fun she appeared to be having. She was just so joyful the entire time. If you watched her compete at all, obviously she was concentrated and focused and determined when she was actually in her events. But even while she was doing that, in periods of her floor routine and things like that, she just had the biggest grin on her face. You could tell that she was enjoying every moment of being out there. And it's something that she has talked about in terms of the work that she has done on her mental health, is making sure that she's still finding the joy in the sport. And this is something I think that dancers really can take a lesson from, because all too often dancers maybe don't prioritize their mental health, or we allow our dedication to dance or our determination to succeed in dance to take away some of the joy that we maybe once experienced, or the reason we got into dance in the first place. And so really remembering why you started dancing, the feeling you felt when you were a little kid, when you first put on your shoes or whatever it was, and really trying to remember that rather than being caught up in all of the sort of like daily grind of things. And there is so much demand in the dance world, and like stress and competition and perfectionism and all of that. And so we really actually have to actively work on some of elements of kind of mental health and mental well-being, because otherwise it's so easy to get swept into those kind of things. So I just thought that was a great display in the Olympics. And she is by no means the only athlete. There were so many athletes. And that's one of the things I just love about the Olympics so much, is the athletes' stories. And I think that's why I like connect with it and why I watch it. Yes, I like the actual sporting events, but what I really love is getting to know the stories of these athletes who, for a lot of sports, they're not in the spotlight day in and day out. These are kind of fringe sports. They're not funded well. These athletes aren't making money doing this. They're doing it for the pure love of the sport. And so hearing their stories of how they got to the top of their sport is one of my favorite things. And along with that comes a lot of them really opening up about their mental health over the last little while. So where, 10 or 20 years ago, we might not have heard that side of their stories when we're like watching the Olympics or seeing these athletes compete on a world stage. These Olympics really highlighted how many athletes are prioritizing that. And not just athletes who are struggling, but also athletes who are really prioritizing the mental side of their game. So there's tons of coverage of mental performance coaches and things like that at the Olympics as well. So the sports psychology side of things is huge. And again, I think dancers can really benefit from that. So that was my number one takeaway, is the sort of prioritizing of mental health. Number two, we saw more older athletes competing and succeeding at the games than ever before. And we really saw people embracing being more mature athletes and embracing that older age and using that to their advantage. And in the dance world, I think we've often, like dancers, their careers are potentially short or have historically been short. And so dancers generally peak sometime in their 20s, let's say, and by the time you're 30, you might be considered old. And that's historically been the case in a lot of sports as well. And specifically, again, some of the more artistic-based sports, so gymnastics and diving and rhythmic gymnastics and artistic swimming and all of those types of sports. But we were seeing older and older athletes competing and succeeding at these games. And I think it's so amazing to see, because if we prioritize athlete longevity and don't push athletes, or in this case dancers, to peak or succeed too early in their careers, we can actually see what these dancers or athletes can do a little bit later on in their careers. So again, Simone Biles, she's not the oldest athlete out there, but for gymnastics, 27 would have been considered way too old previously. And obviously she's like at the top of her game, and she is arguably better now as a 27-year-old than she was as a 17-year-old. And so she's just one example. There's lots of other examples in terms of the Olympics. The fun little stat for you, the oldest athlete at the Olympic Games was 65 years old, which I just think is amazing and so incredible. They were an equestrian athlete, so obviously not every sport sport can you be competing at an Olympic level at 65 years old, but there are sports that you can, and I think that's so cool. And the oldest medalist, like the oldest person to win a medal at these Paris Olympics, was 58 years old. And again, it was Laura Kraut, and she's an equestrian athlete as well. So we have people, approaching 60 years old who are medaling at the games. But in, some of the artistic sports, we maybe don't have people who are quite as old as that, but you still see athletes of sort of older ages. There's a gymnast out of, I'm going to say Uzbekistan, and I cannot remember her name off the top of my head. I think her first name's Oksana, and I can't remember her last name off the top of my head, but she's 48 years old and still competing at like the highest level of gymnastics. She was trying to qualify this year for her, I think it was her 9th Olympic Games, maybe her 8th. No, I think she's been to 8 Olympics. So it would have been her 9th Olympic Games. And unfortunately, she got injured in the qualification meet. So she ended up not being able to compete at the Olympics due to injury. But she is still, at the top of her game and good enough to be qualifying. Like if she had not got injured, I think she was considered sort of like a shoo-in for these Olympic Games. And she's 48 as a gymnast, which is just incredible. And I love it so much. And then like diving as another example, Tom Daley medaled again at these Olympics. And I think he's 30 now, but definitely no longer in his 20s. And he was the oldest medalist on the 10-meter platform, which is one of his events. So we're seeing it even in the artistic sports where we think that people maybe, have to peak when they're early. That is not the case. And they're showing us that even as they get older, they're actually improving and getting better and better. And so, again, Simone Biles, I'm just going to keep coming back to her on this podcast. Maybe it's just a fan podcast for Simone, but she, is doing skills that are technically much more difficult now than what she was doing 10 years ago. So she's continued to improve. It's not just like, oh, nobody else has caught up to her yet. She's continuing to push the envelope and continuing to improve even as she gets older. So just something for dancers to think about and remember is we don't have to peak when we're 18 or 19. And so is it worth it to be pushing dancers when they're 12, 13, 14 to try and kind of like reach these like peak technical skills or like really like, excel at really young ages? Probably not. Can we be a little bit more methodical about how we're training dancers and really think in terms of their longevity? We want dancers continuing to dance into their 30s and 40s and like sort of older ages. So I thought that was really cool at the Olympics that we saw a lot of older athletes who were succeeding. Along those same lines, and I promise this sort of ties in, but supporting parents in their careers and specifically mothers, although like obviously we want to support all parents. This was the first games that there was actually like a nursery set up in Athletes Village for parents who had small children. And this was spearheaded by Allyson Felix, who is like a super well-decorated Olympian. And this is not something that's ever been done before, which was a little bit mind-blowing to me. Like, this is not the first game that there have been parents at. But previously, I guess if you had a family or had especially small children, you often maybe didn't stay in the athletes' village. So potentially those athletes chose to stay in like private accommodation, or they just left their children. So they, children would have been taken care of by a family member or something like that. And then the athlete could be in the athletes' village. But this was the first time that there was actually like a space specifically set up for parents to be able to spend time with their children in the athletes' village. And there's lots of other supports that have sort of gone on, and obviously it's different in different sports and it's different in different countries and federations, but just providing support, whether that be in the form of like nannies or like these nurseries or family accommodations or things like that. If we support parents and especially mothers appropriately, they can continue to perform at the highest level. There were parents who medaled at these games. So there was 2 rowers. They row in pairs, like double sculls. Brooke Francis and Lucy Spurs from New Zealand, and they won the gold medal. And both of them are fairly new mothers. They both have, I think their kids are like maybe 2-ish. They're pretty close in age, like pretty similar in age. So both of them have come back from maternity leave, recovered, and are training and then competing at the highest level, and they won gold. There were loads of other parents or mothers especially competing at the Olympics. Naomi Osaka was another example. And there was a fencer from, I'm pretty sure she was from Egypt, who competed at 7 months pregnant at the Olympic Games, which is like incredible and so cool. So just these examples of what like women and mothers can do and still be at the top of their game. And this absolutely carries over and holds true for the dance world as well. So previously, and again, because dancers weren't dancing as long, and this is how it ties into age a little bit, most dancers were retiring before they ever considered having families. And not a lot of dancers were still dancing professionally while also having children. And that's really changing in recent years. And so now, as dancers are able to dance into their 30s and 40s and like older ages, they're not delaying having families until their retirement. So they are wanting to have families and then come back to professional dancing. And we've seen plenty of professional dancers do this in recent years. And at some of the, like when I'm at dance medicine conferences, there's like been an increased representation of research and people just presenting on kind of supporting women around maternity and pre and postnatal things within the dance world, but it's still not something that's talked about or probably supported enough in the dance world. Companies really should have like pretty well planned out and thought out maternity policies. Like, how do we support these people when they are still pregnant and then after postpartum in terms of postpartum return to dance, not just from a physical perspective. So other things to help support these people. Can they bring their kids into the studios, into the theaters? Is there, facilities on site for breastfeeding, things like that? There's so many things that need to be considered that were not previously ever really part of the dance industry, I don't think. But as we want to support dancers dancing longer into their careers, we really want to make sure that we're supporting parents and especially mothers as well. So I thought that was really cool that was a big highlight at the Olympics. Also, my favorite thing ever is seeing people celebrating at the end of their events with their kids. It's just instant tears all the time. You're like, oh my goodness. I can't imagine anything more special than being able to cross the finish line or finish your event and have, your children there. I think it's just so, so cool. So, just that I think is something the dance world really needs to continue to evolve. It is, like I said, starting to change, and some of the big companies definitely have programs and policies in place, but it's certainly not commonplace throughout the entire dance industry because it is something that's only more recently started to evolve with dancers dancing longer into their careers. Another thing that was really highlighted, I thought, during the Paris Olympics was prioritizing strength and conditioning and recovery, but strength and conditioning in particular. So many athletes, and especially I'm going to go back to gymnastics, the physique that we are seeing on these athletes is so different than what it was 20 years ago. And so we used to have athletes who were maybe more petite. Part of this was because they were younger too. There was a lot of, 14 and 15-year-olds competing at the Olympics previously in gymnastics, but we were seeing really kind of petite type athletes. And now we're seeing really strong, really powerful athletes. And a lot of athletes have been more vocal about, talking about what their strength and conditioning programs are and their conditioning programs outside of their sport-specific training programs. And so you can really see that highlighted. And it's really been a huge shift within gymnastics specifically in terms of what you're seeing the sort of quote unquote typical gymnast look like. They are so much stronger and so much more powerful, and what they can accomplish and perform is just absolutely amazing. And so we see this with these elite athletes in the Olympics, that they are absolutely prioritizing their strength and conditioning. And this is something that dancers really can and should be embracing as well. And I do think we're starting to see a slow shift in that within the dance world, that more dancers are embracing strength training and things like that. But again, there's still this like underlying narrative of, oh, we don't want dancers to get bulky, or we don't want them to get overdeveloped, or it's going to hurt their artistry, or all of these things. And the Olympics kind of proved that wrong, I think. So we see these athletes, and I just think it's so cool to see all these really, really strong, really powerful, especially, again, female athletes. We were maybe used to seeing that on the male side of some sports, and now we're seeing it more so across the board. And I just think it's so empowering for young girls in particular, but even just young kids and young athletes to see that coming up and to see that kind of strength and power represented in those athletes. So I thought that was very cool from the Olympics as well. What else is on my list? This isn't something that was like highlighted so much, but I'm going to highlight it because I always, any opportunity to talk about periodization. And so, the average person watching the Olympics is maybe not aware of this so much, but any athlete who was competing and was at the Olympics absolutely implemented a periodization program. And for most of those athletes, they actually work on 4-year training cycles because they actually want to peak for the Olympics. Now, depending on the sport, there's obviously other times of year they peak for other events, especially like the team sports. If we think about soccer, they're peaking for like World Cup and things like that as well. But a lot of these athletes, especially if they're in a sport that the Olympics are like the pinnacle of their sport, they have been working on a 4-year, and in this case, it's actually been 3 years because the Tokyo Games were postponed. That's another conversation we could have, that really impacted some athletes, like training programs and periodization, because people had trained to peak for 2020, and then all of a sudden those Olympics got postponed and didn't happen until 2021, which meant that they had to kind of like rejig that training year. And then now we've actually only had a 3-year cycle between 2021 and then 2024. But anyway, regardless, their teams would have gone back and like tailored their periodization program. So looking at what are we peaking for? What is our in-season training, building in deloading and tapering and, postseason, off-season, all of those things that I've talked about lots on this podcast before. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, go back and listen to the episode on periodization, and this will all make way more sense to you. But it's just something that, again, the sports world uses, and it would just be considered standard in the sports world. Like, I guarantee you there isn't a single athlete who is at those games who hasn't implemented some form of periodization into their training plan. But in the dance world, it's still quite a foreign concept. Like, we don't, for the most part, implement periodization like as the default, whereas like every athlete who was at those games was implementing periodization, I promise you, even if you didn't see that on display, like, so specifically. And then I think it's my last point. Have I gone through all the other ones? Yeah. So my last point is just providing adequate health care to our athletes. And again, it just highlights it because you can see them on the sidelines, and maybe especially if you're looking, but even in some sports, you see them come onto the field of play. But athletes who are competing at this level all have healthcare providers available to them, like either at the athlete's village if they're getting treatment, like pre and post events and things like that, or actually like on the field of play. So if you were watching any of the team sports, especially like, rugby or soccer or things like that, you will see the physios or the athletic therapist or the team doctor or whoever it is come onto the field if there is an injury or somebody needs help. And just because of my background in working in sports and friends who work in sports and stuff, I know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other medical professionals working behind the scenes at the Olympics as well. So every country, it's going to be slightly different how it's structured, but essentially each sport team. So like we have Team Canada, for instance, or you'd have Team USA or whatever the country sports are. They're going to have what's called like a core medical staff. And that medical staff is going to have a chief medical officer, and it's going to have physicians and then, physios, chiros, massage, athletic therapy, whatever that medical staff is made up of. And that's going to be available to any of the Team Canada athletes. And so they'll have like a medical clinic set up in Athletes Village, and athletes can go and access those medical services. But then certain sports, especially the bigger sport federations, so for instance, Swimming Canada or Soccer Canada or any of those kind of federations that have a lot of athletes competing for them, they will have their own medical staff as well. And so those athletes, so the soccer players, for instance, are going to access physio or chiro or massage or whatever it is, specifically through healthcare providers that are assigned to their team that they probably work with like year in and year out. Those are people who generally work for the federation. So there's multiple layers of access to healthcare for these athletes. And then on top of that, the actual like Olympic organizing committee, so in this case, Paris 2024, will have had medical teams in place and have medical staff at all of the venues as well. Because obviously not every country has the same level of medical support, but all of the bigger nations are going to have multiple layers of medical coverage and medical services available. I don't think any of you guys asked for a lesson on like the background and organization of the Olympic medical structure. But anyway, all of that just to prove the point that these athletes, for the most part, are very well supported in terms of their access to medical care. And this is not always the case in the dance world. So, some of our big major companies, and especially ballet companies, so if we think about the New York City Ballet or Royal Ballet or Australian Ballet or, San Francisco Ballet or any of those kind of big companies, they do have healthcare providers who are generally on site and available to those dancers. But a lot of other companies do not. And so dancers really struggle to access healthcare services or have to figure it out for themselves. They have to make their own connections and come up with their own kind of like healthcare team rather than it being provided. So that's one of the issues in the dance world, is that it's just not as commonplace to have comprehensive medical care. And it should be, because dancers are absolutely performing at an elite level very similar to those of Olympians. And then the other thing is the presence of medical staff on site during events. So again, like all of the events happening at the Olympics had medical staff on site in case something happened and somebody got injured during an event. And that is where I think it's like not standard or commonplace yet in the dance world. And again, some big companies, because they have on-site medical staff, some of those people might be assigned to, backstage coverage during performances, but that's not standard of care at this point in terms of companies. And even when we have traveling companies who come through town in Vancouver, I often will provide sort of, on-site coverage. If it's like a company from out of town, they, have contacts in the city. But even then, it's usually to like come into the theater, 2 hours before performance time or whatever it is, and provide coverage, or not coverage, to provide treatment to the dancers before they go on stage. And then you're, kind of dismissed when it's call time. And so you're not actually backstage in case something arises during a performance. So at this point, dancers still generally, for the most part, do not have access to on-site medical coverage. And this isn't just for professional dancers. This is even like at a dance competition, for instance, it's really uncommon at this point to have on-site medical coverage. And, at elite youth sporting levels, depending on the sport and depending on kind of like what level, there are generally, whether it be a physio or an athletic therapist or something, there usually is some sort of on-site coverage or like sideline coverage, we'll call it, for sports. So this is something that I think the dance world really could take a lesson from the sport world, just in terms of actually supporting athletes or supporting dancers as athletes and having medical coverage available to them, whether it be backstage or even just if it's like on-site coverage, if you're more of a training program or something like that, so that athletes aren't having to scramble or find their own coverage or trying to kind of like sort that out on their own, that they have resources available to them that they know are available to them and are specific to them as a dancer. So that was, I think, the last thing on my list in terms of, things that the dance world can learn from the Olympics. So like I said, this was in no particular order, but I will kind of just go through the little list again as like a little bit of a recap. And this isn't even going to be the same order I presented them in, but we want to embrace our aging dancers and really recognize that, age is just a number and people can perform at high levels for much longer than maybe we initially thought they could. We want to prioritize mental health. We want to implement periodization. We want to provide adequate healthcare coverage for our dancers. We want to support parents and especially mothers in terms of being able to continue dancing at the highest level, but also be parents, and prioritizing strength and conditioning for longevity in our dancers. So I'm sure there are lots and lots and lots of other lessons of things that we can learn from the Olympics and kind of carry over and hopefully implement within the dance world. But these were just my biggest takeaways from watching the Olympics. If you have other thoughts or ideas or things that you would take away from the Olympics and implement into the dance world, please reach out, let me know, send me a DM, send me an email. All my contact information is in the show notes. And the fun isn't over because the Paralympics are happening. So while I'm recording this, the Paralympics have not started yet. They start in about 5 days' time. But while you are listening to this, so the day that this episode drops, I believe there's going to be a couple of days of the Paralympics left. I can't remember what date they end on. But if you have never watched the Paralympics before, I really encourage you to watch. I actually think I might like them more than the Olympics. I don't know if that's true. I like them both so much. But the Paralympics are amazing just in terms of, exposing you to other sports that you maybe didn't even know exist. The sports are different than they are in the Olympics. There's obviously some crossover with things like swimming and track and field and stuff, but there are other sports that you would not know existed, and the athlete stories are absolutely incredible in the Paralympics as well. So go support those athletes. There's a couple of days left. I promise you, you will not regret it. If you are in Canada, CBC Gem is amazing and has great coverage of the Paralympics as well. So please support those athletes. And who knows, maybe I'll end up doing another podcast episode about lessons from the Paralympics. I don't know, but really, go support those athletes. You will not regret it. All right, that is all I have for you today. Hopefully my little recap of the Olympics was fun. I would love to hear if you are also a big fan of the Olympics. So reach out if you are so inclined. And thank you so much for listening today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.